we are going to learn about 2D lists. So this is actually a format of creating a list. So the first thing you have to do is use the first opening and closing square brackets. Then you can now start by creating your elements. So maybe you have different lists. So remember again, your list must be separated by a comma, just like the way you separate maybe a single list with maybe like 1, 2, 3, and 4 and 5. These commas must also have actually a role to play inside here. So by separating them. So if you have strings, then you can actually use the double quotes here, then place other strings. So this is actually a basic structure way of creating lists. So let's now get into, let's dive into a really quick example. So we're going to maybe declare a matrix. Then we're going to assign it different values. So maybe the first matrix we have actually are integers, even integers numbers. I don't know if that really sounds cool. So even integer numbers. No. So we're going to create even numbers 2, 4, 2, 4, 6. So let's just have 3. Then we have our comma. Then we create maybe a prime number. So 1, 3, and 5. Then let's create maybe a 2-digit number. So like 10, 20, and 30. So this is just a simple actually simulation of a 2D list. So to access these elements, we are going to use indexing. But again, so what happens? Let's see if we now print our matrix. So let's see what will be the output here. You now see that it's printing all these elements. So I want you to note it's just almost like a single array, but you remember a single list. So remember, yeah, is an opening and closing square bracket. So let's say we want to access our first list, only this part. So remember, indexing always again starts with 0. So this will be our first element, then the second element, then the third element. So remember that in matrix we have rows and columns. So these are our rows: the first row, second row, third row, then our first column, second column, and the third column. So if you want now to access only the first row, then the first column, that's item number 2. So we are going to actually place this into our matrix. So the first one will be which row do we want to access. That should be the first row, which takes index 0. Then for the first, then the column, so we're going to actually access, so this is the index number 0, 1, and 2. So I'm just going to place that index here. So so allow me to do that. So 0, then 1, and 2. So this is actually the way of indexing into the array. So if you now place here, so we want the first index, the first row, first column, so that's 0 against 0. So if you now print that, then if you run that, you now find that we have access to. So what if you now want to access this? So you found that the row number is index 1, then the column number is index 1. So if we do that, so let's say 1, then also we have index 1 here. So I'm just going to clear that. Then if you run that now, you've solved that we have access 3. Now let's say we want to update this. So let's say the mathematics people have decided that 3 now is actually not an odd number. So we want to place maybe 8 as now our new odd number, although it's not going to happen anyway. So we have to do that, to update a variable inside a matrix. So you're going to say matrix, and then you pass in the 2 index. So we want to update this index. Remember, so it's index 1, 1. So we're going to say we want to update our first row, second column. Then we want to place it a value of 8. Now, if you now print this, let's see what will actually happen. So we expect that 8 will be printed out. So let's print this entire list here. So to print one entire row, so we are going to only have, we are not going to place the second one here. So we are only going to place this one. So we want to print the entire row. So to do that, you're only going to place the first opening and closing square bracket. So we now find that it's 1, 8, and 5. So because we have already updated this to match our variables, our new actually elements in the 2D list. Great. Now let's say we want to go through these elements. So let's assume this is just random IP addresses. So let's not call it IP address, because some of you view networking, that's like, oh goodness, no. Let's say we want to iterate through all these elements. So to do that, we're going to use the for loop. So remember that we talked about for loop being an iteration element. Not an element, but it's used for iteration. So to do that, we're going to say for. So let's call it X and Y. So maybe for the rows. So let's say for the rows in matrix. So that's the first thing is you are trying to iterate through the rows. Then let's iterate again through the columns. So we're going to say for, let's say, columns. So remember that rows and columns are just actually a variable name. So because I can just say for X here. So for that, so this is just what we're doing is for the first external list. Then for the rows, you're trying to assign a new variable here. So the next thing we want to do is we want to iterate through now the list here. So we're going to say for, so let's just call it again. Let's not call it columns, because you might confuse it thinking that we are iterating first through the rows and then the columns. So to do that, we're going to say maybe assign a new number. So maybe let's say for, let's call it just a number, so that it doesn't sound that confusing. So for numbers in rows. So what we are trying to do here is we are nesting the for loop. So what we are trying to actually do is we want to iterate all the entire element. So then the next thing we can do is we can print now numbers, the number variable. So we have actually completed the first part. So you can now see that the numbers have actually been printed. So we have now 10, 20, 30. So what happens if we want to like avoid printing them in a horizontal, in a vertical manner? So to do that, we can actually just give actually a spacing. So we can use the Python end, then put a space so that we can now print all our elements. So then we can use the print to give a nice spacing. So if you now print that, you now find that our elements have now been iterated through, and then we've used the end to actually tell Python, hey Python, we want to print them in different lines. So print this one, then before you move the next, then print them in certain format. So that's why we now have this actually nice. It's looking nice, nicely structured. So remember that in simple terms, what we're trying to do is we are trying to iterate through all this. So you find that now iterations goes in that order. Now, next thing is this list, these 2D lists also have methods. Let's see that, and we finalize it with a simple challenge.